Climate change is an existential crisis throughout the globe, and Africa is affected by climate change more than most regions. But Africa has an equally pressing need: alleviating poverty. The fastest way to develop is industrialization, but for that, you need electricity. It's easy to say Africa can leapfrog forward, but it's not so easy in reality. For now, Africa needs an energy mix, renewables and oil and gas. Everyone agrees, but when it comes to financing that energy mix, well, it's complicated. Hello, I'm Carol Pinault. Welcome to our show, Africa USA Now, current events at the intersection of Africa and the United States. Our program is presented by the World Trade Center in Washington, D.C., and supported by the African Development Bank and the Africa Investment Forum. Today, we're going to focus on energy. Whether it's oil, gas, solar, wind, hydro, wherever it comes from, it's the building blocks of an economy and the most basic necessity for development. Electricity allows for manufacturing, and manufacturing creates jobs, and those jobs create livelihoods and a future for the people. But Africa has a serious energy deficit. Nearly 600 million Africans don't have reliable access to electricity. Africa needs energy, and it needs it now. At COP, the annual UN climate conference, there are constant calls for reducing emissions. But increasingly, there is a general agreement that Africa needs an energy mix. Renewables, yes, but also gas as a transition fuel, and even oil. Almost every country in Africa has discovered oil or gas deposits. Developing projects throughout the value chain that could exploit those resources for local benefit would go a long way towards self-reliance in energy. Recently, the U.S. and several other countries committed to stop public financing for fossil fuel projects abroad. And with so much attention on climate change, if a project isn't green, major funders are steering clear of it. So there's agreement that Africa needs an energy mix, but without money to develop those projects, that energy mix isn't going to happen. It's a complex issue with lots of nuances, but we have a great group of guests with us today. Edmasu Tedesse, President Emeritus and Managing Director, Trade and Development Bank Group; Rajakumari Jandiala, CEO of Yatra Ventures; and Tom Sheehy, Principal at Canela Group. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So, Edmasu, if I can start with you, explain to us why Africa needs the energy mix. Why can't you just go straight to renewables?
Well, it's actually a question of time and a question of gaps. There's a huge backlog of needs that have yet to be addressed in Africa. Half of Africans don't have access to electricity. And so there's a question of how quickly you can move with that. And then there's, of course, the cost aspect. You do have natural gas and coal as being the two largest sources of electricity generation. And of course, to deal with climate change, is looking at raising renewable energy from 1% to 60% in 2050. So you have a situation where renewable is still very, very low, and yet the abundant potential in Africa is massive, and everybody believes that there can be a huge leapfrogging effect that can take Africa forward to meet these huge unmet needs in a very smart way.
Raja, you have a project that is very much a part of the energy mix. Tell us about the project.
We have an investment in East Africa, in Uganda specifically. They already do solar, wind, hydro, on a large scale hydro, and decided they would use their domestic findings for domestic resources. So, and they legislated value addition. And so we're helping them develop how to convert that fuel into LPG, Jet A1, things to grow their industries, agricultural industries. They import nearly 100% of their fuels, which means from Mombasa to their country, it's about 2,500 to 3,500 kilometers. So the emissions from that long logistics chain alone is a huge threat to this issue of emissions in Africa. And two is nearly 90% of the population uses charcoal, which is a deforestation issue. And the major thing for us is It provides jobs. It's 40,000 jobs on this one investment. It's fully financed by the capital market, which means they also do not have to add public sector debt. They don't have to borrow. We're actually trying to help them diversify their financial models because of this issue that you raised, Carol, about public sector no longer has access to energy mix financing. So that means you have to develop a commercially viable, environmentally sustainable project that addresses poverty alleviation. And we're partnering with financial institutions like Trade and Development Bank that Odd Masu is the president of, because we think the African institutions have to drive and help Western investments de-risk and give confidence.
Tom, you were in the House Foreign Affairs Committee for 20 years, a lead staffer. You know better than anybody how to navigate these things. And it seems like in the U.S. that, there sort of are gung-ho climate change, address climate change, and then others denying it. And how do you navigate what Raja just said about the nuances of, yes, this is an oil project, but it also has positive things for the climate to do?
Just picking up on Raj's example of Uganda, I think it's very important for African voices to be heard. And so President Museveni has been very outspoken in defense of what he's doing. And likewise, the Senegalese President Macky Sall has been outspoken as the head of the AU, saying that Africans need to develop all their natural resources, their energy resources, if they're going to develop. And so I'm actually somewhat optimistic, Carol. I think there's been a change in the debate in the United States where it's not quite as extreme from both sides. And so the notion of just it's as simplistic as just drilling oil and that's going to solve our energy crises, or on the other side, on the left side of the political spectrum, people who believe we can just solely use renewable energy sources, that's not realistic. And so I do believe there's been a somewhat of a maturity in the debate in the U.S. where people are looking at more of a centrist approach. Development Finance Corporation, which has a lot of resources to devote to energy development in Africa. Initially, it had a pretty draconian view when the Biden administration came in about, no, we're not going to support natural gas projects. Well, they're supporting at least two that I'm aware of, a project in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and then there's as we know, a major natural gas development project in Mozambique, which is going to be critical. And so we're learning. There's active political debate, and I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I think there's some maturity again in the discussion.
And Masu, you are an investor in Raja's project, in the project throughout East Africa, and it is oil and gas. What made you decide to do that?
Well, sometimes, Carol, what happens is people have knee-jerk reactions. They don't apply their minds to understand the rationale and actually how important some of these types of projects are to actually reduce carbon footprints. In the case of Uganda, the fuel is loaded from so far away, and it has to be brought into Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, and then it gets shipped some thousands of kilometers into the hinterland of Africa. And just to bring in refined product, you're generating such a massive carbon footprint just by shipping it from far away. As many might know, in Africa, of course, you don't have enough reliable household energy. So a lot of communities and households use chopped firewood for cooking. It's cutting down trees and causing other problems on the environmental side. So it may not be perfect for sure, but the good should not be the enemy of the perfect.
Tom, just very briefly, Africa has always been the one place where there really was bipartisan support. Do you think that for the energy mix, there's also bipartisan support here?
I don't see a great partisan divide in the U.S. over these issues. I see a lot of people of good faith in both parties who want realistic, pragmatic solutions. We need to hear more African voices because it's awful easy to sit in Washington or Paris or Tokyo and think about what we need from climate solutions and have no real understanding of what African needs are. And so Masood spoke about half of Africans not having access to electricity. I think it's very important for policymakers to understand this is not some abstract thing. This has real world implications. These are African families who can't study at night in their villages because they don't have access to electricity, or Africans who can't get critical medications because they don't have refrigeration. And so I think it's very important to think about these in human development terms and in real quality of life terms. And so we have to be realistic.
Let's come back to the U.S., specifically to Ohio in the Midwest, where the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, just signed a law that defines natural gas as green energy. Now, natural gas has a smaller carbon footprint than coal or oil, but green energy? In Germany, the government was supposed to phase out coal by 2030, but now the dirtiest of all fossil fuels is coming back. The war in Ukraine and reduced oil imports from Russia have contributed towards an energy crisis that has slowed economic growth. At least 20 coal power plants that were slated for closure are now operating again. So is an energy mix good for some but not for others? How can natural gas be green energy in Ohio, and yet funders are reluctant to touch it in Africa? And while Germany's energy crisis is serious, how much pushback have they gotten for resorting to coal? So again, Maso, I want to start with you. When you see these kinds of things, and you see the difficulty that Africa has had in getting funders to see the importance of the energy mix, what do you think?
When the chips are down and you have to protect jobs and industry and long-term, economic sustainability, countries move into a different gear. And the final analysis, there is something called interest, and countries will pursue it and companies will pursue it. So, I think right now we're in a little bit of a flux. I think the world is not really working well together. And I think you're seeing a lot of, behavior that is very self-focused. That self-interest sometimes manifests in a way that is really unfair. And you start seeing that, certain parties indulge themselves in maneuvering the way they feel they have to, but then they choke others out and don't allow others who need to maneuver, right? And that's where it gets a little bit distasteful, especially given the history of Africa, when you look at, your partner sometimes preaching very strongly, and then when you have to maneuver and you're asking for a just transition, you're asking for time to make the adjustments, and you don't quite see others applying the same level of severity. Everybody wants to move towards the ideal, but sometimes the terrain gets very rough in the process. And it's been rough this past year or so. Countries are fiscally very strained because they're having to pay so much more for just regular fuel to keep the lights on. We need some room to maneuver as well, because we're starting from a much more difficult base, and we truly have contributed so little to the global problem.
Yeah, very much so. Raja, in looking at financing for your project, you certainly have run into this a lot. In fact, even I must say, for booking this show, I was surprised with people saying to me, oh no, we understand the energy mix, but we don't want to be talking about it. And I just want to give people a sense of the size of this deal. How big is it?
It's about $4 to $4.5 billion investment.
Very large, the largest in this part of Africa.
So it's a pretty amazing project.
Yes.
Yeah. So people should be jumping on it. What's happening?
The disconnect between the policy of not financing public sector, which is accepted, but not de-risking the private investment I find is an issue, right? It's okay if you've made a policy decision, multilaterals, there's no public sector to public sector lending or that kind of investment. But Gleneagles Summit says you want to de-risk private investment, drive investments into Africa. They don't need anybody to validate the unfairness of the situation on the continent. So our first investors have been African financial institutions, laying the groundwork, saying the rationale is in line with the national development goals of the regions that we are mandated to support. So we find the partners on the continent have already taken leadership, have already de-risked on the political risk. So then we went to Western and non-Western financiers, and we get three messages. First message, oh, there's a ban on financing oil and gas. I said, no, they're saying they won't do public sector lending. They will de-risk. Article 4 of Paris says if it's in your NDC as a nationally determined contribution, then it's financeable. So all the policy frameworks give all of these institutions the right and the permission and are eligible to finance some of these value additions. Africans have led, they've de-risked. Is the governments themselves are saying, we will put equity through their sovereign funds and through their pension funds. So I'm now always wondering, what is preventing you from helping us get through the last mile of this by either providing political risk insurance or providing confidence to the capital market? We're asking you to show up and really support these policies that you've all signed up to and the mandates you've been given to implement.
If I can just interject, and this project is not just an energy security project for Uganda, it's a regional energy security project. And that's why we felt it was very useful to have as a way, not just also of the security aspect, but also to save very scarce foreign exchange that the region spends in huge volumes to import refined petroleum from the rest of the world, often at great distances and at extra costs, both financial and carbon costs. And there is a strong mitigation effect here. And some of the savings that would be generated on the financial side and the forex side can be used to actually, bulk up renewable energy investments. If you just look at the global envelope on climate financing, it's only about 5% that's come to Africa, even though Africa has 20% of the world's population and Africa has 50% of its people who don't have access to electricity. It's an energy security project that has huge benefits downstream in terms of also enabling more funding to go to renewable energy down the line.
Harold, where we're missing the demographic link, it's the youngest population on the earth. If you don't do employment of these young people, you have a security threat beyond just an energy security threat. And so how do you navigate these new mandates? What is making you stand on the sidelines and watch the game? And why are you not in it? And what does it require?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And listen, as I said, there is frustration with the Development Finance Corporation. We doubled its mandate, its loan authority a few years ago. It hasn't reached near its capacity. It's moved rather slowly. And I know in Congress, the Republicans, they'll have chairmanships to be able to bring up the head of the DFC and really press him on these issues. Why are you not reaching the aspirations that we had for you in terms of supporting not only U.S. businesses, but people don't realize DFC can support foreign companies as well. Consortiums, there has to be a greater understanding and accommodation and partnership with African countries.
The State Department was instrumental, along with the Commerce Department, in promoting and supporting the U.S.-led consortium in the competition. That was in the initial 2 years of the project. So that really was instrumental. So now we're at a different stage. The U.S. support has been critical to get it here. It's just trying to figure out how to execute a mandate under the current context in that regard.
And we should also say that there are dozens of other companies that may not have a project quite as big, but that are also fighting this same kind of battle, that are trying to do this, and that, the influence of these institutions in saying, no, that's not what we do, makes it so others won't come in. So how do you deal with that, Tom? And not put you on the spot.
Raj has been doing a heck of a job on this, but it's a political campaign. Listen, all these institutions have their rules, their regulations, their mandates. At the end of the day, they are going to look at a project and they are going to weigh the political influence. I don't want to say it's overly political because there are rules and we are a nation of laws, but the fact is you have implementers, and there's always discretion in what they can do. And the four of us are very much in the game, and we're talking to Africans. But getting back to Washington, D.C., and some of the people who are making these decisions and bureaucracies, we can't assume they understand some of these basic things like, well, Africans have a different perspective on the energy transition, or this project actually brings a lot of important jobs that are going to improve livelihoods. So it's frustrating. I know I deal with a lot, but you just have to be persistent in arguing your case.
Last year's UN climate conference was held in Egypt and was commonly called the African COP. The conference ended with a surprise breakthrough for a damage and loss fund for vulnerable countries. The only problem is, where's the money? The agreement was really about climate justice. The world's wealthier nations developed through industrialization. But in doing so, they created CO2 emissions that are now causing climate change. Meanwhile, Africa is the continent that pollutes the least, just 4% of global emissions. They didn't cause the problem, but they're suffering the consequences. So Masu, I believe that you were at COP and you saw these negotiations going on.
I think this sort of pillar that's come into being after Sharm el-Sheikh allows this very dynamic and very promising area to actually get traction. It allows countries that have huge carbon footprints to actually make payments for their GHG reductions in a smart way that allows developing countries, and Africa in particular, that has such a low footprint on the carbon side, to get benefits of financing. And that financing can come in and actually help boost renewable energy in a way that wouldn't be possible in a different scenario. Some of the numbers I've seen is, by 2030, that is in about 6-7 years time from now, you can end up with $250 billion of new financing for Africa. And that money can go into boosting geothermal power, wind, solar, and the like.
So when you talk about the new financing that is available, that will become available, you think, where would that come from?
It would be countries that have commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as per whether it's their nationally determined contributions or other commitments that they've made. And if you're not able to do it, or you can accelerate your contribution, that would convert, your commitment into funding that is affordable and long-term in nature, that enables developing countries and African countries in particular to take that funding and develop these very high-impact, promising energy projects. We know that there's very, very attractive renewable energy resources in the region that have actually reached bankable state. And I think this is the one way in which the countries that have the blessing of being so much more wealthier, and the countries that have enjoyed carbon generation to develop over many decades, this is a very fair way to help the world be more sustainable, right? It's a reasonable way of doing it.
Tom, we are in a fight now about the debt ceiling, and I can't see anybody approving any new expenditures. And especially when climate is often looked at as sort of one more donation to Africa, when in fact it's really saying, the wealthier nations caused this mess and they need to come and clean it up. So how do you get that through in Congress?
Well, I agree with you. The environment for spending more money is not good. But I do think it's important to realize that we have been spending money on these very issues. And so we've had Power Africa, which has brought energy to 165 million Africans. At least that's what they claim. But when I was on the Hill, we passed legislation focused on power. We realized 10 years ago that this was going to be an important issue, and we have made very substantial commitments. And I think coming out of the African Leaders Summit, there is a focus on the energy issues. And so I don't know that we're going to get the billions and billions that we're talking about. We've got $30 billion in unused lending authority at the DFC. And so it's finding the bankable projects. As Masu said, it's getting through the bureaucracy. And also, we also have the private sector in the U.S. We have Impact. We've got the Gates Foundation. We've got the Bezos Foundation. We've got a lot of money interested in these issues. And so I think it takes some creativity and harnessing it and moving in the right direction. So I agree with you, Carol. The environment for official development assistance probably isn't very good over the next couple of years, but I do think there are other avenues that we can pursue.
Raja, when you look at the Damage and Loss Fund and that this came out of concerns about climate justice, how do you see that? You've talked so much about how your project is part of climate justice.
For me, there's no debate. There's intention, there's history of helping the continent transition, because Power Africa was a huge initiative to get the ball rolling, and the U.S. was a lead, mobilized the G8, a message to the multilaterals, message to the bilaterals, message to the private sector. For me, that kind of leadership has always existed in terms of justice and transition. We're asking the continent to align three things: post-COVID recovery, policies on resilience, SDGs from a decade or 20 years ago, and how to deal with this energy mix and climate and pairs. So they're fundamentally large agendas, four major things you have to all do, and they don't have the choice to pick one over the others. You know, Germany doesn't need to do poverty alleviation. We are looking for returns, right? Any investor, from a private capital point of view, we're looking for returns. But we're also saying there's a high return, high impact opportunities on the continent. And we're willing to take risks. So it's an issue of risk allocation. It's an issue of de-risking our investments. And it's an issue of taking advantage of the opportunities on the continent as they transition. A transition is an opportunity, right? I fundamentally believe that the justice is already inherent in the policies, but the justice is about implementation, taking into consideration of the instruments that are available to these institutions.
You know, some people have talked about the sovereign drawing rights from the IMF and being able to use those. Do you think that's a viable solution?
If you look at the amount that was issued a year or so back, it's well over $100 billion. The vast majority of that is not being used, right? So that's low-lying fruit. It's just a question of regulatory frameworks and policy perspectives that need to be, tweaked to allow people to be practical and pragmatic, to allow that capacity to be used. I mean, the project we were discussing, East Africa Energy Security project, one doesn't need taxpayer money. One just needs the financial system to become coherent and not block the flow. But you have a disconnect. There's no willingness to look at these types of projects holistically. So everybody's sitting in a very blunt space where nobody wants to really connect the dots. And that's where we have a problem. It's one thing to say, oh, we agree with energy security, we agree with a fair transition and equitable transition. And then when it comes to, compacts being signed up by financial sector players, they literally take a blunt approach and say, no, if you're a rich country like, Germany or the United States or other countries, you don't need anybody to play ball with you. You just do what you got to do. This is where Africa is asking for fairness and for room to maneuver and for a more customized approach.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Admasu Tadesse, President Emeritus and Managing Director, Trade and Development Bank Group, Raja Kumari Jandiala, CEO of Yatra Ventures, and Tom Sheehy, Principal at Canela Global. To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Carol Pinault, host and producer of Africa USA Now. Additional production by Kellen Cody, Alessandro Solase, and Alicia Gupta. Editing by Bansi Freddy. Africa USA Now is presented by the World Trade Center in Washington, D.C. You can find us on YouTube and your favorite podcast apps. Be sure to follow us and leave a review. Our production partners are Africa Global Schaefer and Pixie Corner. A special thanks to the African Development Bank and the Africa Investment Forum for their support. Africa's investment marketplace is championed by the African Development Bank and its partners to accelerate the closure of the continent's investment gaps. For more information on Africa USA Now, visit us at africausanow.com. We hope you've enjoyed the program and that you'll continue to tune in as we delve further into the intersection of Africa and the United States.